Chapter 4, Homework. Mrs. Jewell was teaching the class about fractions and decimals. She explained that .5 or 5/10 was the same as 1/2. Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jewell pretended not to see him. "Ooh, ooh, ooh," Mac groaned as he stretched his hand so high that it hurt. Mrs. Jewell pretended not to hear them. Jenny raised her hand. "Yes, Jenny," said Mrs. Jewell, glad to call on anyone besides Mac. "Mac has his hand raised," said Jenny. Thank you, Jenny," muttered Mrs. Jewell. "Yes, Mac, what is it?" "I couldn't find one of my socks this morning," said Mac. "Me and I looked everywhere, in my closet, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, but I just couldn't find it. I asked my mother, but she hadn't seen it either." "That's very interesting, Mac," Mrs. Jewell said patiently. "But what does that have to do with decimals?" "Because," said Mac, "I only could find half of my sock." "Oh, right," said Mrs. Jewell. "Does anybody else have any questions about decimals?" "Yes, John." "Did you look under your bed?" asked John. "That was one of my first places I looked, but it wasn't there," said Mac. "Did you check your dirty clothes?" asked Ron. "Maybe it was never washed." "I checked," said Mac. "Did you have a dog?" said Bibi. "Maybe your dog took it." "No, my dog doesn't wear socks," said Mac. "Why didn't you just put on a different sock?" asked Allison, "even if it didn't match?" "I thought of that," said Mac. "See, but then if I wore a sock that didn't match, I'd be left with only one sock of that color for tomorrow. And then if I wore that sock, I'd have to wear a sock that didn't match with it, and so on for the rest of my life. I would never wear matching socks again." "Well, be that it may," said Mrs. Jewell, "we really need to get back to decimals." "Yes, Stephen." "Once I had both my socks on," said Stephen, "but I wasn't wearing any shoes. My mom had just waxed the floor, too. I slid all around on it like I was skating. It was a lot of fun until I fell against the kitchen table and broke 2 dishes. Then I got into trouble." "What's that got to do with my socks?" Mac asked impatiently. Stephen shrugged. "Did you ever find the other sock?" asked Leslie. "Yep," said Mac, "but you'll never guess where." "In the refrigerator." He held out his arms in the bewilderness. "How did it get in there?" No one knew. "See, here it is," said Mac. He climbed on top of his desk so everyone could see his feet. He pointed to his left foot and said, "This is the sock I had from the beginning." He pointed to his right foot and said, "This is the sock I couldn't find." His socks were red with gold lightning bolts down the side. "Ooh, hot socks," Mauricia said. "No, it was cold after being in the refrigerator," said Mac, still standing on top of his desk. "I made up a song, too, while I was looking for it. You want to hear it?" he sang. "I got one sock, looking for the other, one sock looking for its brother. When I find the sock, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put it on my foot and I'll stick it in my shoe." The bell rang for recess. "Since we didn't finish the arithmetic lesson," said Mrs. Jewell, "you'll have to do the rest of it for homework." All the kids groaned and headed outside. After recess was science. Mrs. Jewell was teaching the class about dinosaurs. She told the class that there were 2 types of dinosaurs. Those that ate meat and those that only ate vegetables. "You mean like broccoli?" said Rondi. "I don't think they had broccoli back then," said Mrs. Jewell. Just as they were different kinds of animals back then, there were also different kinds of vegetables. Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jewell pretended not to see him. "Ooh, ooh, ooh," Mac groaned. He looked like he was going to explode. Mrs. Jewell pretended not to hear him. She called on Myron. "Mac has his hand raised," said Myron. "Thank you, Myron," muttered Mrs. Jewell. "Yes, Mac." My uncle grew the biggest watermelon you'll ever saw in your whole life. Man, it was huge. It was so heavy I couldn't even lift it. Mac, what does that have to do with dinosaurs? Asked Mrs. Joel. Because that must have been the kind of watermelon that dinosaurs ate, said Mac. Did you eat it? Asked DJ. Not all of it, said Mac, shaking his head. Phew, it was too big for me, and I love watermelon. What did it taste like? Delicious, said Mac, but lots of seeds. You shouldn't eat the seeds, otherwise a watermelon might grow inside your stomach. I once heard about a lady who was so fat that everyone thought she was going to have a baby, but she didn't have a baby. She had a watermelon. Was it a boy or a girl? Asked Joy. Everyone laughed. Mrs. Jewell never finished her lesson about dinosaurs, so she had to assign it for homework. After school, Matt walked home with his girlfriend, Nancy. Nancy's class was on the 23rd floor, Wayside. Matt carried his arithmetic book, his science book, his reading book, his language book, and his spelling book. Nancy didn't have any books. I'll carry your books for you, Mac, she offered. Matt gave Nancy his books. Don't you have any homework? He asked. She shook her head. Man, it's unfair, said Mac. Mrs. Jewell assigns more homework than any other teacher at Wayside School.